Then There's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. On this edition of Then There's California, we'll share the second of two conversations with California state senators reflecting on the U.S. Supreme Court decision in June that nullified 50 years of abortion rights in America. As we mentioned in the last episode, when the draft Supreme Court opinion on Dobbs v. Jackson was leaked in May to a national outcry, many began to reflexively wonder if hearing the news of a feared final ruling to overturn Roe would feel as sobering. Well, indeed, when we heard the final news of the decision back in June, for many women and their reproductive rights allies across the country, across the world, it was truly an angering and devastating moment. 13 states stood ready to effectively ban abortion almost immediately after the decision was announced through so-called trigger laws, and more states are following in the same direction. But again, as we have spotlighted several times on this podcast, access to abortion and needed reproductive health care in California will continue to be protected under state law, as we join Oregon and Washington in a united West Coast trifecta of continued access to that care. And California voters this fall will have the chance to decide whether or not they want to enshrine the right to abortion into our own state's constitution. On our last episode, we were joined in conversation about this issue by State Senator Nancy Skinner, the Vice Chair of the Legislative Women's Caucus. This time around, we're joined by yet another extraordinary policymaker in the California State Senate, whose voice and legislative agency has also helped place California in the perfect position to be a safe haven for women from out of state seeking abortion services that are still legal. State Senator Ana Caballero represents California's 12th Senate District, with the city of Salinas on one end and the city of Merced on the other. And like her bio says, Senator Caballero is a woman of firsts. She was the first woman mayor of Salinas and also the first Latina elected to represent the 28th Assembly District in 2006. She served in Governor Jerry Brown's administration as the Secretary of the Business, Consumer Services and Housing Agency, and she was elected to the State Senate in 2018. And Senator Caballero is currently the chair of the Senate Committee on Governance and Finance. Senator Caballero has been with us a few times on this podcast, and we're glad to have her back. Senator Caballero, good to see you.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here.
And like your colleague, Senator Nancy Skinner, I know this last week of session before summer recess, as we speak, has been a very busy time, getting bills to the governor in late-night sessions, and then passing and getting signed by the governor, the largest state budget in the history of California and the largest in the country. And in the meantime, you are hardly resting. You're also hosting a group of young legislators from your district at the state capitol today. So it's been a busy time.
It's a very busy week.
Well, tell us a little bit about the legislators. I mean, that must kind of stir your and inspire you in the midst of all this craziness to see these young people paying it forward, I guess is what you're doing,
yes,
right?
Yes. Well, we do a young legislators workshop and invite high school students to participate and to be involved. We did it by Zoom because of COVID. Makes it a lot easier in a rural district for students to get on a Zoom meeting than it is for them to travel miles to be able to get together. And so we brought them up in a bus, one bus from Salinas and one from the Central Valley. And it's the culmination and the graduation, if you will, of the program. They learn about how government works. We have guest speakers that come in and talk to them about what they do and how they do it. They do a mock hearing. So they take one of the bills that I've introduced and they argue it. So they learn some skills, and they also learn how government works. And, you know, there's nothing like coming to Sacramento and seeing the Capitol. And for many of these students, they've never really left their community. And so it's a big deal to get on a real nice bus. And so they'll spend the day here, go through the California Museum as well.
That's fantastic.
It's just fabulous to see them.
And even though the quietness of the building sometimes belies everything that's going on, it's been a nose to the grindstone time, in particular about the state budget, as we mentioned, the largest state budget in history, the largest state budget in the country right now. And as you have said, it's a budget that's a statement of values, and particularly in perspective of what we're talking about here, that's important.
That's correct. Absolutely. It is a budget that speaks to the values that Californians feel are important, and it's got some great things in it, highest expenditure of resources in education than we've ever had. There are resources to put money back in people's pockets because of these tough economic times. And some people are still getting evicted from their homes and have utility bills that they can't pay because of the COVID pandemic. And there's resources for reducing the homeless population, but also for the first-time home buyers that are looking to create some equity in a house and to establish roots in a neighborhood. And so there's a little bit of everything that people could desire in a bill.
That's great. Well, as I had discussed with Senator Skinner in the last episode, mixed in with the legislative and budget deadlines, there's been the reaction to events surrounding us and that profoundly affect us, including the Supreme Court ruling on Dobbs v. Jackson. And I mentioned at the outset how we were all shocked by the draft ruling, but the fact that when we actually saw the ruling, it was still shocking. Did that resonate with you? Is that how you
Absolutely.
felt too a week or so ago?
Absolutely. I guess we are hopeful people at our core. We want to think that even though we see bad news coming, that maybe it might change in the interim, and it didn't. And quite frankly, there were some signals in that opinion that should have us all worried. We live in a democracy, and part of living in a democracy requires that we treat everybody equally, and that whatever applies to one group of people should apply to all. And many of the decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court have rested on the right to privacy, and rightly so. And people argue, well, abortion is not in the Constitution. Well, I dare say that neither are women in the Constitution. And so that has me very concerned. So it was shocking nonetheless.
In my conversation with Senator Skinner in the last episode, we talked about how some people believe that this ruling on Roe v. Wade by the court takes us back to a time of unsafe abortions and secrecy, and many are proclaiming that we won't go back. But another group of people believe that the country, our culture, our society has changed so much since the time before Roe became a constitutional right that abortion is now supported by the majority of people in the United States. There are abortion pills available. Women who even consider having an abortion are under attack, and even especially those doctors and other medical professionals, the people who could help them procure an abortion. So in some ways, this really is uncharted territory that we're not going back, that we may actually be going to somewhere worse, if that's possible. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think the analysis that things have changed is absolutely right. I think that individuals that are capable of getting pregnant feel very strongly that what happens to their body is up to them. And that despite the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court has said this right that you have had for 50 years, that right was erroneously given to you. I think that's what the court decided. And they left it up to the states. So in one respect, they've abrogated the fact that there are 50 states and we, in many ways, we operate together on some issues. And the Constitution is one of those issues, and privacy is really one of those issues. And they've sent it to the individual states. And so now we have to begin our work state by state. And what I'm really hopeful for is that there is this Western trifecta standing up to that decision, and we will be a haven. And it's going to behoove many of us to figure out how can we help our sisters and other individuals in other states to make sure that they have the resources they need, that they can organize, that they can change the laws of their state. More individuals need to get involved in politics, and that means they need to run for political office. They need to help organize and have their voices heard. And so in one way we go backwards, but in other ways it has become a lot easier to prevent a pregnancy from getting to a point where you have to have an abortion by going in to see a doctor. There are safer alternatives, and you can do it quicker, sooner. And the states that are saying you can't take a pill in order to effectuate that are going to find that they just can't control it. They just can't, because you can get things on the internet. You can procure things a whole lot easier, and we have to make sure that that's available to all.
This part of the conversation is reminding me that you come from or are part of a family of nurses.
Yes.
And I am interested to know how this is impacting the women in your family who are part of the medical community who are seeing this going on and could be directly dealing with this kind of thing.
Absolutely. Well, my mother was a nurse, and so my mother was a very strong supporter of the right to privacy and the right for individuals to make their decisions about their own body. And she never talked about the personal experiences that she had, but She grew up in a very isolated, small rural community. And what she taught me is that you need medical professionals that are helping you. And once you make your decision, it's your decision to make. And so she passed away this year.
That's right.
And I think she would be shocked and dismayed if she had seen this decision come down, because she was a very, very strong proponent. And the other family members that are nurses are just as shocked and disappointed.
We come from a generation that remembers the profound debate and freedoms and empowerment that came along with the original Roe v. Wade ruling back in 1973. Can you share some of your memories of that time? Now, Senator Skinner, when we talked, she talked about her own personal situation with an abortion, with a miscarriage.
Yes.
But what can you share of the time and what maybe was going on in your life, or just what was happening in that world?
Well, I've heard Senator Skinner speak before, and she's a very powerful voice and has personal experience. You know, what I remember is I'm a Catholic, and I believe in the sanctity of life, and I come from a very large family. And so in that large family, you end up with pregnancies and other people that adopt the kids, and you move on. But those are really difficult times and difficult decisions. And the challenge, what I recall about that time, is that there were very, very few choices. What young women were struggling with when there was an unplanned pregnancy was, do I go to Mexico for an abortion in Mexico? And you don't know anything about the system down there. You're just going down and you have faith that it's going to be safe, but you don't know. And do you have the money to do it, right? Or do you use a backstreet abortion procedure that we knew and heard was severely damaging and injuring women because it was done wrong, and could lead to sterility and death for the individual that made that choice? And so the choices were very, very limited. At that time, birth control was very difficult to get, and it was a very high dose of estrogen that was really difficult for many of my friends to tolerate. And so our choices were awful. The risk of pregnancy was high, and the end result could be death. And so it's one of those things where, as a young person trying to make choices for yourself, you think, well, how come I have to bear all the cost of this? And we've never really prosecuted men for their contribution to the situation. And, you know, whether you agree with that or not, it's not the subject today, but many of the young women that end up pregnant, and I'm talking about teenagers, they got pregnant from men in their 20s. Then the statistics are extremely clear that they get pregnant from individuals that are over 10 years older than them, and it's abuse. The laws on the books say that that's abuse, but we don't prosecute it. So we leave them abandoned at that time to make a choice that is extremely difficult, emotional, and that they have to make on their own with no support from anybody. Yes. And I think that's not where we want to go as a society.
Thank you for sharing that. There has been this conventional wisdom to say that the court's original decision on Roe v. Wade was really what has been the catalyst for the last 30 years of political polarization of us as a country. But in a lot of ways, it really wasn't the court that caused the polarization. It was, to some degree, as you have said, just this attitude of control, of wanting power. And God forbid we give women the autonomy and the power over their own bodies, much less anything else. And it's not even an attack on abortion as much as it also is an attack on democracy. Do you agree with that thinking?
I do. I think the challenge is that in many ways, people use religion as a way to try to control what happens to other people, or what can happen to other people, right? But the other part of it is that the world is changing very rapidly. And when I was growing up, women didn't generally work outside the home very much. They worked at home a lot, but not outside the home. Mm-hmm. And there's been this transition to women working outside the home and fathers being more active in the rearing of their children. And all of that is really good, but it scares people. And so there's this clamping down on the rules of society, if you will. Mm-hmm. And that's a really hard genie to put back in the bottle. As an individual with very little power, once you realize that your strength and that your activism makes a difference and that you can change the way that you're treated, then people are not willing to go back, and people are not willing to give up the right to make choices for themselves. And I think that's really important. As long as you're contributing to society and you're building something for yourself and your family, however you define it, that's a good thing.
Let's talk about California's role here, as you've already alluded to. It's reported that 1 in 4 girls and women in the U.S. will at some point in their life seek an abortion. And it's a good bet that in 2022 and moving forward, many of those women and girls are or sometime will make the journey to California for abortion care. But to say we're a sanctuary for women is one thing, but to actually be that and provide that service is another. Talk about the work that you and your colleagues in the Women's Legislative Caucus are doing legislatively and otherwise, including giving us your perspective and description of SB 1142 that you and Senator Skinner have co-authored. All of this to pave the way and open the doors.
Well, I think it's safe to say that we are united as a caucus. We don't always agree on everything in terms of policy, but on this we are absolutely united. And the estimates of how many women and other individuals are going to need these services, it's hard to know. But we need to be prepared because we have our own population to service as well. We need to make sure that we're not overwhelmed and we don't have the capacity to assist. And so there's a whole series of bills that have been introduced and that are moving through the legislature with great success to provide the resources and the platform from which we can ensure that individuals that need reproductive services know what is appropriate and when, and what resources are available for them. And so Senator Skinner and I are working on a bill that would provide a website that would have medically accurate information as well as information on where you can access those services closest to you, if you will, and the resources, financial resources, because sometimes for many of the individuals that are seeking services, they need transportation assistance, they may need child care, they may just need insurance to be able to provide further service. And so we want to make sure that if and when there are resources, and we know there will be, that those are available and you know where you can get them. That's going to be critically important because it would be very easy for the service providers to be overwhelmed. So sure. That's number one. Number two is that California will invest in a fund. It's already in the budget. Very thankful to Governor Newsom.
That's the Abortion Practical Support Fund?
Correct.
Is that it?
Correct. Okay. It's $20 million. And that's to help women to access an abortion if they decide that's what they need. And it's financial resources. Part of what we expect is that the abortion providers will have this estate fund to help residents of the state of California, and then another fund that people can contribute to that would help other individuals that may not be California residents to be able to access services here in California.
And then not to mention, of course, the SCA that you and your colleagues passed, sent to the governor. It's now going to be on the ballot that will enshrine the right of abortion into our Constitution.
That's right. So the ACA is really important because what the U.S. Supreme Court has said is it's up to the states. And what we're concerned about is what the U.S. Supreme Court did could happen at the state level in any state. And we want to make absolutely sure that the voters have an opportunity to weigh in on it so that it becomes a constitutional amendment, and individuals that are capable of getting pregnant here in the state of California know that that right cannot be taken away without a vote of the public. And so it's really important, and I'm really proud of our President Pro Tem of the Senate, Senator Atkins, for her work on this. We're going to get it right.
Absolutely. Well, despite the strength and assurance as a supportive sanctuary for reproductive rights, we are already home to 20% of the U.S. abortion clinics, but more than half of the state's abortion clinics are concentrated in 5 counties, and you may be aware of that for even the counties in your district. And I guess there's a lot more anti-abortion crisis centers than there actually are Planned Parenthood centers. So there's still a lot of disparity in what's available.
Well, that's true. That's true of medical services.
True.
For any medical services.
Which has certainly come to light during this COVID pandemic. Yes.
Absolutely.
And you and I have talked about.
You know, when you pass out resources based on how many health clinics you have in the community, then you're in trouble because in rural California and in our poor communities, we don't have any health care services that are close. And so that's reflected in our abortion clinics, but it's also reflected just in our clinics, period. Mm-hmm. And so California has made a huge contribution in our budget to healthcare, and we were successful in getting coverage for all our undocumented workers in the state. Huge effort on behalf of the Latino caucus, and that's because there are not only a lack of services, but then there are certain populations that are excluded from participating in healthcare coverage, and we want to overcome that. We want to cure that. And so we're working on all of that to make sure that we're doing everything we can to get people good health care and that they get good information on what options are available. And you know what, Brian? It occurs to me that probably what we should do, this whole issue, the splitting of people over the issue of abortion, is we probably should have a discussion about the pill works up to a certain period of time, and that probably shouldn't be called an abortion because that's not a viable individual, if you will.
Right.
It's not viable all by itself. And it's so early in the process that to add it to the statistics really is, I think, a misnomer.
Almost like equating or putting miscarriage and abortion into
together.
the same.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Well, perhaps something as you come back in the new year, there can be some clarity here for California.
Maybe.
Maybe. I may be seeing the birth of legislation right here. One of the key things that we know that the court's ruling will most likely affect and have a powerful impact on women of color across the country, and many of those coming to California for abortion care who are uninsured, they live in states without Medicaid expansion and lack access to medical resources. Is reproductive justice a priority on paper and legislation as well as it is an attitude and a policy for you and your colleagues?
It is. That's part of the reason for the fund, is that there is a justice issue. What we can do is ask people to donate and to contribute to funds to be able to help. But in the end, we've got to change the laws in those states. That's the best way to deal with this issue. Otherwise, women and other individuals that are capable of getting pregnant, they're having to travel these long distances. And make no mistake, wealthy women have always been able to get an abortion. They just go to another country or they travel to our states, right? The injustice is it is individuals that just don't have the capacity and that are looking out for their families and want to do the right thing in terms of providing the necessary resources, and that's food and clothing and housing for the children that they have. And that's, man, the innumerable individuals that get pregnant when they're going to school and just are not ready and not capable and maybe have decided they never want to have children. Mm-hmm. I think we need to respect people's choices, and that's part of what this is all about, is respecting choices that people make. Not everybody wants to be a parent. Not everybody will be a good parent. And the days of having 9 or 10 children because there was no option, those days are not sustainable in our world anymore. And there's no reason that we should dictate that families should be that big because there are no options.
As we talk about this, it reminds me here in California, not to mention the rest of the country, there are certain parts of the state that are very conservative, that are very pro-life and anti-abortion in their politics and in their work, and particularly even at the local level. We talk about disparities of clinics or disparities of healthcare. You're not necessarily going to see a lot of the local officials joining you in some of your support for making California a sanctuary state. How do you reconcile the fact that even though the majority of Californians, the majority of the country supports right to access and supports abortion, you're not speaking for all of California?
That's
particularly.
Right. That's absolutely right. And you know what? I just have to say that I respect people who say that we should not allow abortion. I get where they're coming from. I would like to think we can live in a world where abortion does not become necessary anymore because we have such good health care and prevention measures that accidental pregnancies don't occur. Now, that doesn't deal with rape and incest because those are cases where there is abuse, and I'm not sure we ever get away from those situations where young women are preyed upon, and that we need to allow abortion for those instances. But I do think that the possibility of not getting pregnant gets higher. The challenge I have is that many of the individuals that do not want to see abortion also don't want to see contraception.
Right.
And I don't see that day happening. I just don't see that day happening. And what worries me about those positions is that it is a position that says the government has the right to tell you what can happen with your body. And that's where that whole privacy discussion becomes so important is that there are decisions about individuals that should be left to the individual and to family members and consultation with friends so that you have an opportunity to decide what's best for you. I don't want the government coming in and telling me what I can do with my body and when I can do it. And that privacy right is really, really important. And it spreads into all kinds of things, like same-sex marriages, like marriages between different cultures and different races. All of that used to be controlled by the government, and because of the right to privacy has stopped. And I think that's where people feel most comfortable, is that it's a tyranny when you have the government telling you what you can do and where you can do it. That's not to say you can't have rules making things illegal, but it's about the personal things in people's lives.
You again bring up some passionate points here to remind me too. In the previous podcast episode, I asked Senator Skinner for her perspective on the politics of abortion rights and directed her attention to a recent column by LA Times writer George Skelton, where he described a moment in state legislative history, a time in California at the state capitol right before Roe came into law. And here in California, a Democratic-controlled legislature had passed an abortion rights bill that was then signed by a Republican governor,
That's right.
Ronald Reagan. And there were Democratic lawmakers who were very Catholic, who really, really had to agonize about that vote, as there were Republican, very conservative lawmakers who had to agonize about a vote in favor of this. Here we are, 30-plus years later, the SCA that you and your colleagues voted for, a lot of the other abortion rights and reproductive rights bills, no Republican colleagues of yours are definitely not going to go on it as
Right.
a yes and may be
Right.
voting no. It's a world of difference. It's so polarized and political now.
Right. That's absolutely right. Right. All this stuff has become polarized and political. And that's why you'll see the Republicans are really uncomfortable when you talk about LGBTQ plus rights. Many of the time they refuse to vote in support of bills that make a lot of sense. And I think they are afraid of their constituency. And I think that's part of what has polarized the entire country, is that these things become part of a fundamentalist push that would take us back to days when government did control. I mean, when you take a look at the founding of our country, in order to vote, you had to be a white male that owned property. Mm-hmm. Well, who owns property? And who owned property back in the 1700s? Well, it was people that had wealth, right?
Right.
And so it excluded a huge portion of the population, and we've spent how many hundreds of years working our way out of that hole and granting the rights to people that we take for granted. So that's why I say I think the genie is out of the bottle, and we just have to organize ourselves. But we also have to teach. We have to teach our young people and not so young people what the democracy was founded on, why it's important to defend it, and why it's important to stand up for individuals that are different from you and grant them the same rights that you have. We aren't there yet. We have a long way to go, but I think you've seen some movements around that try to get us there. And when you lose power, what happens is that there's this urge to go back to the good old days, right, and take it back. And I think that's what you see happening with the polarization in this country. And it's my hope that if we continue talking, continue organizing, and really talk about the values that we have. What are the values that you think are important, and are they important enough to struggle to make sure they're protected? We'll be able to reverse this decision and keep the U.S. Supreme Court from going any further. That's my hope, but I'm an eternal optimist, so we'll have to see. We have to put it into practice.
Well, I'm grateful for your eloquence on this. Last time around, I brought to Senator Skinner's attention, and now I bring to yours, a provocative quote from Cecile Richards, the former national president of Planned Parenthood, from 2006 to 2018, I believe, who wrote that if she had one regret from her time leading Planned Parenthood, it is that she and her allies believed that providing vital health care with public opinion on their side would actually be enough to overcome the political onslaught that we've talked about here, the presence of Roe v. Wade that we've marinated in for the last 30 years. She said that she underestimated and wasn't cynical enough to fully comprehend the callousness of the pro-life movement and conservatives in the U.S. and their willingness to trade off the rights of women for political expediency, and how threatened they were that access to abortion and choice, God forbid, actually helped and empowered women. Keeping in mind everything we're talking about here and how we got to this point, what do you say about that?
Well, she's right in strong language. But let me just say that I also think that there was a moment in time when we were working on the Equal Rights Amendment that we had an opportunity to go back and just keep pounding on that.
Yes.
So that women would be written into the Constitution, because it seems to me that that movement was really powerful. And somehow we got almost enough states. But then when we couldn't get the last couple that we needed, we took our foot off the pedal and we didn't get it done. And it just seems to me that we lost an opportunity to make sure that we're enshrined in the Constitution as equal, and that then we could have gone on to some of the other issues that we've been working on. And so I think she's absolutely right. I think that what we didn't keep our eye on the ball on is that the Republicans realized that they needed to take over the court, and that if they did it with dogmatists, that the culture wars would be front and center in the U.S. Supreme Court, which they have refused to take on forever, right? But they've waded into popular culture right now, and
with an argument that it's not in the Constitution.
That's right, and that's very dangerous to people who believe in equality.
Well said. Looking forward now here, it's clear that a Supreme Court season of dismantling the America that we've pretty much taken for granted over these last few years, that California's resistance and California's presence in this process matters now more than ever, and that the story doesn't end with this ruling, and California is an example of that, and that no longer can we be complacent. One of your former colleagues, now LA County Supervisor Holly Mitchell, said that we have to be warriors, that we have to be activists, all of us, in this process if we want to somehow maintain or preserve any of these rights. Do you see that happening in California? Even in your own district, are you seeing people that perhaps 6 months ago weren't warriors and they are now?
Well, I think it's going to take time. I think that the warriors that have been around a long time have put on the shields and are getting ready, right? I think of the Marvel comics, and I think of the women characters we've put on the armor to get ready. What we have to do is encourage our younger folks to join us, because it's all new to them. And so we have a lot of work to do, because to organize takes a lot of effort. And you have to make sure you're organizing not to burn things down, but to lift everyone up. And I have to be careful not to be so angry that we turn into the rioters, the January 6th rioters, right? And I don't think any of us would do that. But when we start something, we need to be able to control it and to make sure that it's focused on doing good. So we have work to do, and I think we're going to see some great warriors come out of that, because young women today have grown up with expectations, and again, the genie's out of the bottle, and it ain't going anywhere. So that it's exciting to think that complacency is gone, and I think you'll be interested to see a year from now what's different.
Well, your optimism is helpful to know, because in some ways you could say, here we are now looking to the future. Did you ever believe that this fight for reproductive rights and racial justice and equity was also going to have to be the fight that perhaps your own grandchildren will have to fight? The young legislators that you brought to the Capitol, one of them may be in your place in a generation from now or less, still fighting for this. Does that sadden you, or does that give you optimism?
Well, I think if there's anything you learn as you get older, is that things kind of come in cycles. And so you go one step forward and 2 steps back, or 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And so I'm really glad I live in California. Again, we don't all agree on everything, but there is a sense of optimism in this state, and we know how to get things done. And the Women's Caucus is a very powerful, potent force in the legislature. So I think we're going to be just fine. But it's the rest of the country that I worry about. And quite frankly, we're one of the 50 states. And in the Senate, we only have 2 seats, just like Wyoming and Nebraska and, states that have very few people, but yet have the same vote that we have. And so there's a lot of work to do to change some of that, and there's work to do to make sure that it's not just the 3 states in the West that are standing up and working together, that there are other states that want to come on board. And I think you're going to see some changes in some of those states, because women and other people that are allies are not going to put up with it.
Perfect note to end this on. Thank you so much for your tenacity and clarity in this discussion. I'm really glad to have you here. Thank you for joining us, and then there's California.
Thank you so much.
State Senator Ana Caballero. And that is a wrap for this edition of Then There's California. We're a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus, with technical assistance and production support from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulte, Brian Shadden, McLeana Woods, Lisa Murphy, Michelle Baker, and the graphic artistry of Tim Davis. On behalf of State Senator Ana Caballero of Salinas, representing California's 13th Senate District, I'm Brian Green at the state capitol in Sacramento. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.